Hello everybody, this is Yasmeen from Yarkspiri Fantasy Art, and right now I'm going to just draw on top of your existing artwork just to give you some feedback on some changes you might want to consider in the future. So I'm going to start with the basic structure of the character because that is important whenever you're starting any drawing. Now you do have quite a few good ideas on this, so I'm just going to create a new layer here, and I'm just going to draw right on top. I'm going to try to use a color that's very visible as well. So right now I'm just going to plot out the existing pose that you have, and in order to do that I'm just going to do an actual stick figure. This is normally the easiest way to figure out an actual pose, an existing one, especially from life reference, because it doesn't take too long to do, but it gives you all the necessary information to break down the pose. So now I do keep my basic breakdown fairly close to an actual skeleton. Now it looks like the shoulders are coming upwards, so I'm going to plot it out as such. Okay. Okay, so this hand is actually pretty good pose-wise. This one's not bad. Maybe turning the skull just a tiny bit to face the viewer. It's going to be a more difficult thing to draw for sure, but it will look more appealing if you do so. Okay. Alright. And the head. Okay, so I'm going to create a new layer. And I'm just going to go on top of this with a different color. I'm just going to choose the brightest color I have on my palette here. I'm also going to increase the brush size a tiny bit so it'll be easier for you to see, and change my brush. Okay. So the general pose is actually not too bad. You do have a very strong line of action, which is always good to see. Line of action is a general line that goes through the character that helps the pose read a little bit more. So I'm just going to delete that. So I'm going to keep this initial line of action. I'm going to recommend that, because your character is facing forward fairly extensively, that maybe you tilt the hips a little bit more, what you already have, and maybe bring this leg in a little bit. Okay. So now that this leg is here, this leg is off. So you have to bring that leg back more. So you can keep this the way it is, but you're going to have to bring the actual foot and leg further back. Okay. So if he's afraid of this skull, then what you want to do is maybe having him holding it further away from him. So maybe tilting his hand a bit. And then you can have the skull facing the character as well. Okay. So that would give you a more interesting pose without changing it too much. You're definitely going to have to, if you do go with these changes, change the pose for the leg. Now if I draw a center line across my character, you'll notice that he's still slightly off balance. So what I'm going to do is I'm just going to bring this arm out a tiny bit more, and a little bit further up. Okay. I'm just going to turn that off so you can see the current pose. Now the head, you might want to change the head a bit too. It's not bad, but maybe have him tilt his head a little bit more towards that one shoulder. Okay. Okay. So now that I've redrawn some of the basic skeleton here, I'm just going to redraw the structure underneath as well. I'm going to use a different color. I'm also going to soften the red up because it's going to be have too much contrast to it. Create a new layer. Okay. So I do have the rib cage of the character right here. So this is roughly where the chest area would be. Now if he does have his shoulder towards his head, you really want to show that compression. Okay. Now just working out where some of my basic landmarks for the anatomy would be, roughly, because that makes a huge difference on your overall drawing. Okay. Plot out the leg. Now, as you notice, I'm just using really basic shapes right now, and that's important because it keeps me from getting too distracted by the details. And when you get distracted by the details, you lose your overall focus on what you're trying to achieve pose-wise, which is why I normally start with basic structure first. And this is something you can always easily modify also. Now in order for this leg structure to work, the foot does have to be facing a little bit more forward. I'm just going to change our perspective a tiny bit. It's important to ground the feet, so I'm just making sure that the feet are properly grounded as well. Okay. Okay, so the hand's moving forward, and because it's moving forward, it is important to show the foreshortening. So especially for this part here, what I would normally do is I would refer to my mirror. I do have a mirror next to me when I'm figuring out my poses, and this really does help. It saves a lot of time as well. It's not cheating. Being smart is not cheating. So if you are afraid that it might be considered cheating, all the good artists look at reference, because that's how artists learn. They imitate life, and in order to imitate life, you need to reference it. So the best thing to do is to pose yourself out in that pose if you're not sure how to actually draw it. And I do that fairly often. All the illustrations that you see, I've posed out normally. Some of them are done from my head, but I do generally try to take my poses off something I can actually do physically. It helps me find out if, first of all, it's actually possible to do, because a lot of cases you may think it's a really awesome idea to do a certain pose, but unless you actually do the pose yourself, you won't realize that there's actually some severe limitations in what the body can actually do. Which is why it's always good to double check. Now, I haven't referenced any of this pose, so because I'm just doing a really quick critique here. And don't have too much time to do these, so it'll definitely be a first come first serve if there's multiple. Essentially whoever emails me first, and if I have time. So okay, so already you can see that the pose does work a little bit better. Just gonna lighten that up a bit. So I'm gonna group these as well, so I can hide them easily. So that's the original pose. It's actually not bad, and the rendering is actually pretty good. It's getting there, for sure. It's going to be a little bit harder to figure the intestines that are coming out, so you're going to have to reference that. Unfortunately, you may have to actually look at some references of maybe dissection references, because those are pretty good. Especially anything that has maybe the pig anatomy, because it's fairly close to the human anatomy. I doubt you'll find actual human dissections on even on Google. You may find it, but I doubt it. Now, there is a couple of things you can also look for. If you can find actual human dissection books, I do have a human dissection book that I use as a reference. I don't currently have access to it though, so I won't be able to tell you what page might be useful. But I would just Google for some references and you'll probably be able to find some for sure. Okay, so let's just work on some of that armor elements that are on the character next. I'm just going to go over the basic ones. Create a new layer here. Okay, so he has these shoulder pads, and they're wrapping around his shoulder. So in order to do that, I'm just going to switch to a different color. You want to plot out roughly how it's going to wrap. Now, because his shoulder is more towards you, probably actually won't see this curve. It'll probably seem more like this curve actually. And you're probably going to get it wrapping behind like this instead. Now, because it's doing that, you'll see a slight curve, most likely here. Now, what I've done in the past too, if I've actually sculpted a really rough sculpt of a structure, if I couldn't figure it out, it's rare that I do that, but it is a good step if you're having trouble figuring out how the perspective would move, or if you have any knowledge of 3D, I do recommend you you build just a rough model just so you can figure out how it would wrap around. Okay, so if I turn that off, you can see already how that's looking like it's wrapping more along the shoulders. Okay. If you do the other side here, you definitely want to do the same thing. It's actually not bad here. The concept's actually pretty interesting for this character. Okay, and this would actually go behind the head so you wouldn't see that. Okay. Those are the shoulder pads. That's probably going to be one of the more difficult portions to figure out. Now, if I try to figure out the intestines here, you have your rib cage that goes up here, roughly around this area, and you have your spinal cord that would go here, and you also have your hip bones. Do a rough shape like this. Now this is extremely rough, so I don't currently have my reference with me. Okay, I'm actually looking up right now on Google images for intestines in order to understand how they're structured and where they would be located in the body. They're actually located fairly low Now, if they were spilling out, it would probably actually be the larger intestine. Actually, no, sorry, the smaller intestine, which is on... No, the larger intestine, which is above the smaller intestines from the diagrams that I'm seeing. And it tends to wrap just below the stomach. So you would still see the stomach, which is roughly here. So that would still be intact. However, if this started to spill out, because it tends to wrap normally right underneath that area, it would actually start falling. So you're probably looking at something like this instead, for the large intestines at least. Now, unless these were actually cut, the smaller intestines, they'd start to fall out, but it would be the large intestine that would come out first. I'm just going to make that a little bit more readable here. So unless the character's intestines are actually being cut, you wouldn't see individual tubes coming out. Now, you could use some artistic license and still include those anyway. But generally you wouldn't see those, and then you would still have some small intestines over here. The stomach actually goes underneath the rib cage here, so that's important to note as well. And depending on how much muscle you still want to show, you probably still see a tiny bit of muscle here. Now the rib cage wraps around and then goes up behind. Once again, you might want to show some flesh attached to that. So you get a structure roughly like this for the anatomy. It's actually, this is really rough, but that's roughly what you would be looking for if that was the case. Now the gauntlets are pretty simple, so I won't go over that too much. Let's see what else we have here. The armor is going to be somewhat complicated to figure out. A portion going above almost the rib cage area, so I'm going to have to change colors here. Give me a sec. Okay, so if I switch between the two, it goes up. Goes up and then down for that area, and then it would do the same thing but on the other side, so it would curve that way and then wrap around, something like that. Then there's a crest going into the center. I have to make sure these line up, however. So it's almost an M shape on the bottom. And you do have two crests that are essentially, from the looks of it, going where the chest muscles are. So you'd be looking at something roughly like this. Okay. Now, in order for this armor to actually be somewhat usable, it would have to have an opening for the shoulders, so I'm going to recommend definitely doing that underneath the shoulders. And I believe that's the most complicated part there. Yeah. You got the general idea for the cloth in the bottom here, so I'm not going to worry about that. Now it's going to wrap because the leg is in front, it's actually going to wrap around this though, so just keep an eye out for that when you're working on that. Alright. So let's quickly go over the second drawing, which is this one here. Just going to create a new layer and group that so that I can turn it on and off. Okay. Now this one's still in its beginning stages, so we're just going to go over the pose then. Switch to a brighter color. We're going to break down the existing pose, so if people laugh at you for drawing stick figures, guess what? I still draw stick figures. You know why? They're simple and they're fast to draw. And I know quite a few artists that still use stick figure to this day, so it's a very basic thing, but it really simplifies the breakdown, which is why a lot of people tend to use it, even professionals. Okay. So that's a really quick breakdown of this existing pose. It's actually not a bad pose. Now we probably want to try breaking up that silhouette a bit. So I'm going to create a new layer, and I'm going to go over it with a different color, and I'm going to lighten this up a bit so that you can see it a little bit more. Okay. I didn't like the way that was looking, so I just restarted it. I actually tend to use a triangle for when I'm drawing girls, just because it sums up their basic shape a lot better. Now you do want to exaggerate that hip, so even if she's very skinny, you still want to exaggerate the size of the hips in comparison to a male character. Okay, it's looking a bit better. Now she would most likely have her leg a little bit more towards her. Because most people actually don't tend to kneel straight forward. Okay. So although she's holding that dagger in that one hand, it would still probably be better to have her arm more outwards to break up that silhouette. Okay, and then have her maybe holding that dagger on an angle similar to this. Okay. Now our proportions are still a bit off, but that's going to give you a general idea of what you need to work on. I would break down the existing character that you have and work out from reference. What I actually do when I'm trying to figure out how to draw something new, if I haven't drawn it before, is I will look at my reference books, and I'll actually put a piece of paper on top and trace on top until I can figure out the basic shapes that would simplify that drawing. By doing that, you understand the overall structure. It's also a lot faster to learn. You don't show anybody those drawings. They're your own personal drawings, so I normally throw them out because I don't normally need them after I've learned the one character. The reason why you do that, professionals in the animation industry do that, especially the ones, well, specifically the ones who do traditional drawings, is because it takes a while to learn a new character and to be able to reproduce that character several times. So in order to be able to do that, you need to understand the general structure, and the only way to understand that is to break down an existing model sheet of a character. Or if you have photo reference, then you break that down instead. So I'm going to recommend doing that just because it's going to make it a lot easier when you're actually drawing your character. Now this one's still really rough, so I'm not going to go into too much to costume designs, and this should be enough for you to work with because it's going to require quite a bit of work before you come up with a pose that you are comfortable as well. So I'm just going to turn that off so we can see the original one. It's actually not bad. You have the general idea for the shading, so that's fine. Switch back to the other one here. Once again, your rendering is actually pretty good, especially for the metal areas, because that's showing up very well. The pants are actually pretty good. It's just the structure and the pose that you seem to be struggling with for now, so that's probably the areas you want to concentrate on until you can actually figure it out a little bit more. And that does take a while to learn, but once you learn it, it makes a huge difference on your drawing ability. So I really hope that helped, and I hope to see you in the future. Thank you and take care.